The forest was unusually quiet when the rangers came upon the thicket. There, pressed low against the damp earth, a small bear cub lay curled into himself, his body barely rising and falling with each breath. His fur, damp with dew, clung in patches to his thin frame. For a moment he did not stir, and it was only the faint trembling of his shoulders that betrayed he was alive. The silence around him was heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding still, watching. At such a young age, a cub should never be alone. In the wild, mothers remain near, their presence steady and protective, guiding their young through every danger. But here, there was no sign of her. The undergrowth carried no fresh scent, no tracks pressed into the softened soil. The cub's isolation told its own story, one of loss or sudden separation, the details of which would never be fully known. The rangers stood at a distance, careful not to crowd him. They knew the fragility of such a moment. The cub was not just small, he was terrified. His head lifted slightly, ears twitching to the faintest sound, and then he pressed himself deeper into the brush as if vanishing might keep the world away. His wide, dark eyes reflected a mixture of confusion and fear, darting toward movement and then back to the ground. He let out a faint whimper, thin and broken, the kind of sound that in the wilderness would summon his mother instantly. But the forest remained still and no answer came. The cry drifted upward, fragile as smoke, before dissolving in the canopy above. The rangers exchanged quiet glances, understanding the weight of what they had found. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. Sunlight fell in scattered beams through the canopy, striking his fur in soft patches of gold. His breathing quickened as he realized he was not alone. Every slight shift of the human's boots against leaves made him flinch, his tiny claws scraping the earth as he pulled tighter into himself. His body language was raw with distrust, the instinct of a creature whose only safety had been taken from him. One ranger crouched low, lowering his profile in a gesture of calm. He spoke barely above a whisper, his words soft enough to be lost in the rustle of leaves. "Easy, little one." The sound carried no urgency, only a steady gentleness, the kind a frightened animal might recognize as non-threatening. The cub's ears flicked toward the voice, though his body did not uncoil. Minutes passed this way, the rangers still, the cub tense, the forest breathing around them. In those minutes, every detail seemed heightened, the slow drip of water from leaves, the faint chirp of a distant bird, the trembling lines of the cub's fragile frame. It was not a scene of sudden action, but of suspended time, where trust, fear, and survival coexisted in silence. The cub shifted once, lifting his head just enough to look again at the figures watching him. His nose twitched, testing the air. He did not rise, but he did not cry again either. His silence spoke as loudly as any call. A silence full of waiting, of uncertainty, of the unspoken question of whether these shapes before him meant harm or hope. The rangers did not move closer. They knew the first step was not theirs to take. For now it was enough to bear witness to this fragile life trembling in the thicket, to acknowledge the stillness that held him like a fragile thread. Around them the forest carried on, yet in this small hollow of silence, a quiet beginning had been found. The cub did not remain in the thicket for long. As the rangers shifted their weight ever so slightly, he bolted deeper into the undergrowth, his movements clumsy but quick, driven by instinct rather than strength. The brush swallowed him, his dark shape disappearing between stems of fern and tangled branches. For such a small creature, his presence was easy to lose, reduced to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under hurried paws. The men did not follow. They knew that pursuit would only deepen his fear, pressing him further into flight and leaving him exhausted. Instead, they waited, lowering themselves into the quiet rhythm of the forest, letting the cub's own choices guide the fragile balance between distance and closeness. The silence was broken once again by a sound that carried the truth of his condition. A thin, wavering cry, sharp at the edges, as though both hunger and loneliness pushed it from his throat. It rose and fell unevenly, lingering in the still air, and then was answered only by his own silence. Each call was brief, uncertain, and filled with strain. His voice was not the steady demand of a healthy cub secure in his mother's care. It was fractured, like a note that trembled before it could fully form. Between cries, he retreated farther, hiding his body in the shadows where roots and branches cast him nearly invisible. Only the small shift of his fur against dried leaves revealed his presence, a flicker of movement that betrayed how restless he was beneath his stillness. The rangers placed food nearby, simple offerings left without expectation, and stepped back, giving him the space to choose. The air smelled faintly of fruit and grains, carried lightly by the breeze that moved through the trees. For a long time he did not approach. His nose lifted, twitching, but his body remained pressed low, as if the ground itself offered him protection. His paws shifted nervously, claws dragging lines into the soil, every small sound from the humans causing him to freeze again. Patience defined the hours that followed. The men spoke only in quiet fragments, words intended less for meaning and more for tone. "It's all right, little one," one whispered, his voice as soft as the wind through needles above. The cub's ears flicked back, acknowledging the sound but never yielding his fear. He did not trust, but he did not run again either. Shadows lengthened across the forest floor as the day moved on. The cub's hunger pressed against his hesitation, stirring him from his crouch. He stepped forward once, paws light and uncertain, then pulled back just as quickly, retreating into the safety of shadow. This pattern repeated, a fragile dance between need and instinct, until he simply sat, his body tense, his eyes wide. The food remained untouched, the distance unbroken. In those long, still moments, the rangers watched the shape of his fear. His sides rose and fell rapidly, his breath shallow. His ears turned constantly, tracking every distant sound. A bird overhead, the crack of a branch far away, the faint shifting of men who tried to stay silent. His body told a story of vigilance, of a life balanced between survival and collapse. He was too young to be so alone, too fragile to bear such weight. Yet the forest had given him no choice. The day closed slowly, the last strands of sunlight threading through the canopy in broken beams. The cub gave no sign of comfort, no gesture of surrender, only the weary stillness of an animal caught between fear and hunger. The rangers did not push closer. They knew trust was not won in a single day. As the forest cooled into evening, the cub remained a frightened shadow among the roots, unseen but never forgotten. Morning returned to the forest with a softened light, threading through the canopy and warming the ground where the cub had hidden through the long night. His cries had grown faint by dawn, reduced to quiet whimpers muffled in the brush. Hunger pressed heavier upon him now, an invisible weight shaping each hesitant movement. His body carried the restless energy of fear, yet his paws dragged slower, as though the emptiness within had begun to dull his strength. The rangers waited at a respectful distance, their presence calm and unhurried. They laid food again, not closer but not farther either, repeating the quiet offering in the same place as the day before. The cub lifted his nose, catching the scent, but retreated immediately, his claws scratching shallow grooves into the soil as he backed into shadow. His instinct still drove him to distrust, to keep the forest as a barrier between himself and the unknown. Hours passed in this fragile rhythm of approach and retreat. The cub lingered near the brush, his small body hunched low, ears flattened, his eyes darting between the food and the figures who waited. Each time his paw shifted forward, his body stiffened, and he froze, trembling with the weight of choice. The men did not move. They let silence carry their patience, broken only by the occasional soft murmur that drifted no farther than the space between them. "Easy now," one said, voice low as the hum of the forest. The cub's ears twitched, registering sound, but his gaze did not soften. By midday, exhaustion pulled against his hunger, weakening the rigidity of his stance. He lowered his head, breathing in the smell of fruit and grain, his tongue flicking briefly against the air. Still, his paws refused the ground between them, as though crossing it would bind him to danger. Instead, he chose stillness. It was not trust, but it was no longer panic either. He remained crouched, his sides rising quickly, yet he no longer scrambled into the depths of cover. The rangers understood this shift for what it was, the first fracture in the wall of fear. A moment where the cub's instincts bent beneath necessity, and his body allowed the space between to remain unbroken. They did not celebrate or press forward. Their movements stayed slow, deliberate, shaped by the understanding that each gesture could either hold or shatter the fragile thread forming in the silence. Even the forest seemed to quiet around them, as though holding its breath. The cub stretched his neck forward, his nose quivering, and then collapsed back into himself with a soft huff, curling tighter. His small frame shivered with the conflict between need and dread. The humans did nothing more than sit in patience, waiting through his indecision, allowing time itself to teach him that danger did not follow their stillness. As light faded in the afternoon, shadows stretched across the clearing, painting the cub in soft gold where he crouched. His eyelids lowered, heavy from the strain of constant watchfulness. For the first time since they had seen him, he let his body rest in place without immediate flight. His paws tucked beneath him and his head lowered to the earth. He did not close the distance, but he allowed himself to remain visible, no longer vanishing into the undergrowth at every sound. The Rangers exchanged a glance, not of triumph, but of quiet recognition. They knew the small victory was not in what he had taken, but in what he had not. He had not fled, had not abandoned the space between them to fear. This stillness, fragile as it was, marked the beginning of something they hoped could grow. The forest held the moment gently, leaves whispering in the breeze, the smell of earth rising as evening drew near. The cub's breathing steadied, his small body pressed low but no longer quivering. He had not yet trusted, but he had paused in the language of his own survival. And in that pause, a thread of possibility began to form, quiet and unseen, binding the space between them with something almost like hope. Days passed in the same patient rhythm, the Rangers keeping their presence steady and calm while the cub lingered on the edges of fear and hunger. Each sunrise brought the same quiet routine. Food left gently in the open, soft words spoken into the silence, long hours of waiting without movement. What had begun as frantic flight slowly softened into hesitant stillness. The cub no longer vanished at every sound. He stayed, watching, measuring the distance with wide eyes that told the story of his mistrust. On the fourth day, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of rain that had passed in the night. The ground was softened beneath the trees, patches of mud holding the prints of animals that had moved through before dawn. The cub emerged from the undergrowth more quickly than before, driven by a hunger that gnawed too deeply to ignore. His body looked thinner, the fur along his ribs shifting with each shallow breath. Yet still he did not rush to the food. He lingered, head low, ears swiveling, every muscle taut with the weight of decision. The Rangers held themselves completely still, their eyes steady but gentle, their bodies lowered to appear less imposing. They knew the cub had reached a threshold, a place where instinct fought against need. His paws dug at the soil, restless as he tested the air. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted forward. One paw pressed into the softened earth, leaving a trembling print. His body quivered, torn between retreat and advance, but he did not pull back. This first step was small, yet it carried the gravity of survival. He paused, crouched low, his sides rising quickly with shallow breaths. His head lifted just enough to glance toward the men before darting back to the ground. The gesture was fleeting, but it marked something new, acknowledgement without panic. The silence held him, and for the first time, he allowed it. Minutes passed as he remained frozen in that posture, suspended between fear and trust. Then he moved again, this time a half-step closer, his claws scraping against stone as his paw landed. His eyes darted once more toward the Rangers, then back to the food. His body trembled, his fur bristling with the strain of being exposed. Yet still he did not run. The men exchanged no words at first, only a shared glance that carried quiet recognition. When one finally spoke, his voice was little more than breath. "That's it, little one," he murmured, the tone soft, steady, meant only to ease the air between them. The cub flicked his ears but did not retreat. Instead, he lowered his head and shuffled closer, his paws hesitant, his body angled sideways as if ready to flee at the slightest wrong sound. Finally, after long, fragile moments, his nose reached the food. He did not eat right away. He sniffed, pulled back, sniffed again, his head jerking in nervous bursts. His body twitched with every sound, his gaze flicking to the men as though seeking any sign of threat. Only after another long pause did he take a single bite, chewing quickly before retreating one pace. He stood there, chest heaving, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The men remained still, offering no reaction beyond their quiet presence. That evening, as the light faded through the trees, the cub returned again to the food. His steps slightly less frantic, his body slightly less rigid. The space between fear and trust was still vast, but a line had been crossed. His paw prints, pressed into the damp earth, told the story. For the first time, he had chosen to step forward. The days moved gently, each one carrying the faint rhythm of healing. The cub, once trembling with hunger and fear, began to show small changes that marked his return to life. At first, it was in the way he touched the ground, hesitant paws no longer dragging with fatigue but pressing forward with steadier steps. His body, still lean, found strength in nourishment, and his breath no longer rattled with exhaustion. The quiet care of those around him shaped this transformation, not through force, but through patience. Meals were left where he could find them without fear of hands, water set nearby without intrusion. Slowly, the cub began to trust the spaces where kindness waited. The air around the enclosure softened as the cub's movements grew more playful. In the early mornings, when the mist lay close to the ground, he would paw at fallen leaves, batting them gently before bounding forward with awkward leaps. His steps were clumsy at times, his body still remembering weakness, but his spirit carried a lightness that had not been seen before. The rangers watched without crowding him, speaking only in soft tones. "You're doing well," one whispered once, though the words were more for themselves than for the animal. The cub lifted his head at the sound, ears twitching, then returned to his play. Rest returned to him as naturally as hunger had once haunted him. At dusk, when the fading light wrapped the landscape in gold, he would curl into the grass and let his body settle. No longer did he startle at every sound. No longer did sleep break with sudden jerks of fear. The steady rhythm of crickets and distant bird calls became a song of safety. Even in stillness, his body spoke of change. Muscles that had once drawn tight in defense now loosened. His sides rising and falling with a peace that spread into the hearts of those who kept their silent watch nearby. It was in his eyes, more than in his body, that the shift could be felt most deeply. They no longer held the wide, glassy look of panic, but a clearer reflection of life. When he looked toward the rangers, there was no human-like gratitude, only a recognition that these figures did not bring harm. He began to approach without the urgent hunger that had once driven him, pausing at a distance that was his own to choose. A quiet exchange took place in those moments, the unspoken understanding that survival had been shared between them, and that trust had begun to grow. Food became less a desperate act of survival and more a steady rhythm of living. He ate with measured bites, pausing to raise his head and scan the space, but no longer rushing as though the world would take it from him. His small body began to round, fur shining in the sun with a softness that had once been dulled. Between bites, he would pause, nose lifted to the wind, catching the scent of grass, earth, and the distant memory of wild freedom. Each breath seemed to tie him more closely to the life that waited beyond these protective walls. In time, play turned into practice. He tested his legs in sudden sprints, circling the space with bursts of energy that left him panting but eager for more. He crouched low as though stalking unseen prey, then sprang forward with youthful clumsiness, the instincts of his kind awakening within him. The rangers, standing at the edges, did not interfere. They knew these moments were the bridge between survival and freedom. One of them murmured softly, "You'll find your place again." The words dissolved into the air, carried away on the evening breeze. As the sun dipped low, shadows stretched long across the grass, and the cub rested with his head lowered on his paws. His body, strong now, rose and fell in the rhythm of calm breath. The land around him was quiet, touched with the orange glow of fading light. In this stillness, he belonged to both worlds, cared for by humans, yet called by the wild. Soon the path ahead would open, carrying him back to the life he was born to live. For now, the day closed in silence, the last rays of sun holding him gently in their glow.